Welcome everyone. Is this on? Yeah. Welcome everyone. You hardy lot. It's the draw of these two. But thank you so much for joining us for changing the narrative of progressive politics. I'm Alex Sloan. I say this with a bit of risk because I noticed that Musa deplores positivity, but I describe myself as a happy Canberran. He's just going to have to forgive me. I'm also lucky enough to be Deputy Chair of the Australia Institute. And I think Musa would also say I am definitely a symbolic capitalist, so I'm just going to own it right now. I think a lot of us in the room might be. I'm really delighted to be your MC tonight. I wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. We're on their land that has never been ceded. And this is NAIDOC Week, a movement born out of mourning and protest. It has now grown into a powerful national celebration and a platform for the issues still affecting Indigenous people today. So I would just want to say I'm glad to live in the ACT, where we voted yes to both acknowledge our First Peoples in the Constitution and for them to have a voice on the policies and matters that affect them. It's not rocket science, you know, and I think, in fact, Musa might be talking a little bit about that tonight. Before I introduce our speakers and get you to roundly welcome them, I'd like to play you a short video of some of our achievements that we couldn't have done without you, the supporters. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's basically a full house, and I think once people get through the traffic and light rail disruptions, and we all support light rail, don't worry, once they get through, this will be a full house tonight. But away you go with the video team. Thanks so much.
I think it's really important to have a think tank, a group, looking at the overarching principles. One of the things that makes it special is that it encompasses all the issues confronting Australia.
The Australia Institute, it's revealed that 2/3 of people in this country believe corruption is common.
The Australia Institute shows 90% support for rules around truth in political advertising.
Well, more than half of the gas exported from Australia is royalty-free, according to research from think tank the Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
If we collect more tax and lower the price of energy, lower the price of medicine, lower the price of childcare, lower the price of going to the doctor, you know what we'll do? We'll lower inflation.
The question isn't whether Australia has the capacity to lead with integrity. The question is whether the people in this building have the courage to do it.
Poverty is a policy choice. These are things that can be addressed. We know how to do them.
I and others would argue that actually more often than not Australia's relationship with the United States makes us less safe.
This great submarine deal is almost certainly going to result in us having no submarines. It's a terrible, terrible mistake.
Government has to change its view.
Destruction of native forests.
Australia is one of the biggest consumers of fashion per capita in the world.
Climate integrity.
A whistleblower protection authority.
Record profits and price gouging.
90% of Australians are saying, we think this is a good idea. Our parliament could do its job.
To have institutions like the Australia Institute doing original research that underpins the arguments of those who want to reconstitute the dream of democracy, that is the greatest gift to anyone who wants to keep the idea of democracy alive.
Just some of the highlights from the past year, and we're really excited for the year ahead. Just by the way, you will have seen this. It's got a little QR code on there, so if you'd like to donate to our work, please just scan the QR code and also sign this. You heard Malcolm Turnbull there. Look, let me get to our special guests this evening, and he's blown my mind reading this book. What a rock star. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Musa al-Gharbi. Dr al-Gharbi is the sociologist and assistant professor in the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University. His research primarily focuses on the political economy of knowledge production and the social life of scholarly and journalistic outputs. He's a columnist for The Guardian, and he's also been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, and was cancelled by Fox News. But please welcome. And speaking of rock stars, the Australia Institute's very own Dr Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs. She's also a historian and writer, did part of her research right here in the National Library, focused on the history and politics of the United States and its role in the world. Her newest Vantage Point essay is out. It's great. It's entitled After America, Australia and the New World Order. It draws on her extensive research on the Australia-US relationship and her recent experience in North Carolina and Washington during the final days of the 2024 US presidential election campaign. And the essay also explains the current landscape and how Australia can chart its own path to prosperity and security. Please welcome Dr Emma Shortis. Musa. Yeah, it's just so fantastic to be talking to you. And as soon as I said to anyone, everyone in Australia seems to know who you are. You've covered some ground. Now, you write in the book that part of your motivation for writing it came from discussing how you noticed the dissonance between rich Ivy League students claiming victimhood after Trump's 2016 election, while ignoring the working class stuff they relied upon, and you identify the hypocrisy perpetuated by symbolic capitalists. Can you just take us through what you mean by that?
Sure. Okay, can you hear me? All right. So I guess there were a few incidents that started to kind of crystallize, that set into motion the set of questions that I try to answer in the book. So before I was a fancy nerd, I did a lot of work, like I did freight for a while. I was unloading and loading trucks. And the last thing I was doing before I moved to the Ivy League was I was working at a shoe store in the mall at Sierra Vista, Arizona. I met my wife there. It was great. And then so I made this shift from being a kind of small town guy into moving to Manhattan and attending an Ivy League university. And I happened to do this right before the 2016 election of all times. So to me, the outcome of the 2016 election wasn't that surprising. I had been spending most of the preceding cycle trying to urge, writing in Salon and other outlets, trying to urge people to take Trump's prospects more seriously, mostly screaming into a vacuum. But at Columbia, this was not the assumption. The assumption going into election night is that progressives were on the right side of history, that the election was going to be a blowout, that the Republicans were going to be destroyed for a generation. And one of my colleagues, dearly, I love this colleague, but he made a meal of beef Wellington and, okay.
You really have tapped into the Australian vernacular.
He made a meal of beef Wellington, caviar, and fine wine to kind of celebrate the election of this left-aligned candidate. And it turned out to be kind of an awkward meal. And so the next day, the day after the election, it was walking around New York. It was kind of it was surreal. It was like a bomb went off or something. And then when I went to the campus at Columbia, a lot of the students and the faculty and the staff were crying. A lot of them were saying that they needed to be excused. They were too traumatized by the election result to kind of do their work. So they wanted to be excused from their work. And this kind of a thing, in my class on social theory, we were supposed to discuss W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the only black theorist we were going to cover all semester. Instead of doing that, we had a conversation about our feelings. And there were a lot of people who were crying, making very striking projections and stuff like this. And I was kind of perplexed by the reaction in a number of ways. So one of the things that I observed was a lot of my colleagues at Columbia, like I said, they were asking for accommodations for themselves, time off, and so on. There were all these other workers around the students and the faculty members, the people who mow the lawn, the people who clean up the campus, the people who serve the food, the security guards. While the students and professors at Columbia were disproportionately people from well-off backgrounds, and the ones who didn't go to an Ivy League school well-off. You leave well-off, look at me. These other workers are the very people who, in our narratives about what would happen after the election, the rich and the powerful would be better off than ever, the little guy would be trampled underfoot. First, we're the rich and powerful. So in our own narrative of what the election would happen, the kind of people who are at Columbia and who graduate from Columbia are precisely the kind of people who would benefit in our own account of from someone like Trump. But there didn't seem to be a lot of recognition of this. Instead, a lot of the people at Columbia, at an Ivy League school, were depicting themselves as vulnerable, as especially marginalized and vulnerable to Trump and his regime. Meanwhile, these other workers, the people with the most at stake in our own narratives in this election, there was no movement for them. There was no effort to pay them more, give them time off, give them a break. And you also didn't see these workers, these other workers, they weren't going around sobbing histrionically about politics as they're scrubbing rich kids' poo out of the toilets and stuff. You didn't see the janitors like, ooh. They just showed up to work the next day and they did their jobs. And this juxtaposition was sobering. And I don't want to pick on, and I'm not picking on the Columbia students here, because it's the same thing was true of the faculty, and the same thing was true broader. If you walk through Manhattan on the Upper West Side, you saw the same thing. You saw all these affluent professionals kind of comforting themselves, weeping for the disadvantaged, even as they were waited on even more because they were too distraught to cook. They were too distraught to clean. And so they had to rely even more than ever on these other workers to kind of, and the reason they were able to do that is because, again, these other workers, they showed up the next day and they did their jobs. And so this kind of juxtaposition was sobering, and it was one of these things that kind of led me to ask kind of, what's going on here? And it wasn't just an analytical question, it was also kind of an existential question, because I was one of these folks in this campus. I was there for the same reason as everyone else. I was, and so it was also kind of a question of like, what am I doing here? What is, where do I fit into this picture? What is the picture? And so this was an example of one of the kinds of episodes that helped put these questions in my mind that led to this book.
So and Emma, you had a similar experience actually at your time at Yale. It mirrored this as well.
It did, yeah. I arrived at Yale about 2 years later, in 2018, 2019, and by then they'd stopped crying. They were, I perhaps naively expected to find an institution in crisis, having an identity crisis about how something like this could happen in America. I expected them to still be consoling each other and asking for time off. But they weren't. They were fine. They were, still deeply distressed by Donald Trump and found him obscene, found him vulgar and sad, but were mostly still very comfortable and comfortable particularly in their power. And again, perhaps it was naive of me, but I found that quite shocking. It was shocking to be in an, I don't want to downplay the opportunity that I had. It was extraordinary and life-changing to have access to some of the leading thinkers in the world. But at that time, in the middle of the Trump administration, to go to a theatre like this and see Henry Kissinger speak as if that was still normal, or to sit right here where my colleague Alan is sitting in front of John Kerry and Al Gore and have them interview each other about environmental politics, as if things were normal and that, you know, they were still so assured of their positions. But I think the hypocrisy that struck me the most, or the dissonance, I suppose, that struck me the most was that when I was there, the Parkland massacre happened in Florida. And I, you know, of course, I had taken my 2-year-old at the time with me, and so this was something that was always on my mind. And then Parkland happened, and I went onto campus the next day, and amongst many conversations, realised that Yale is about 25 miles from Sandy Hook, which is a horrifying realisation. So I was working with people who, during that incident, you know, whose children go to school in the same district, knew that their children's schools were locked down, but didn't know which school was under attack. So for hours, thought it might have been their children who were experiencing this massacre. But I think the most horrifying thing, you know, was talking to people who had had this experience. Was I would have similar conversations with the very same people, very powerful people, you know, people with tenure at Yale, very worldly people who had lived in other places, who would always ask me in that very kind of Yale American networky way, you know, what are you going to do next? And after Parkland, I started saying, I'm going home. I'm taking my daughter home. But, you know, I can't send my child to school here. And the reaction was almost universally an initial kind of understanding, and then you could sort of see the eyes glaze over as people would dismiss that as being unambitious, or you know, there was an inability, I think, to compute that you wouldn't be willing to take that risk in order to go to the best university in the world or to live in the best country in the world. And that resignation, that you just live with that risk, was deeply shocking to me. And it wasn't until much later that I realised why it was so shocking. And it was so shocking because these extraordinarily powerful people had experienced that directly at Sandy Hook, and they'd done nothing about it. They had resigned themselves to this being a normal part of life. And of course they're insulated from a lot of it because of their privilege. You know, they send their children to school with better security, etc. But it's still a real risk, and one that they had experienced. And these are people, you know, who at the time when I was there in 2018, four of the Supreme Court justices were Yale Law School graduates. Yale has produced several presidents. The current vice president went to Yale Law School, and none of them had done anything about this. And it was that hypocrisy and that failure, I think, to really recognise the extraordinary power that these institutions do have. You know, Yale sits on an endowment, when I was there, of $40 billion. It's significantly larger now. But there's this, I think that power is quite deliberately hidden, and it's not deployed, it's not used in ways that universities should use it, which is to make the world better and make the world safer. It's used to perpetuate inequality.
So the sitting is the key word. Musa, you describe 4 great awakenings in your book, times when elites talked a lot about inequality, but you note that they did little to shift material inequalities for most underprivileged people. What distinguished these awakenings from social movements that did actually shift inequalities?
Yeah, so one of the big contributions of the book is there's been a lot of talk that something changed in the culture after 2010, right? A lot of it was really vibes-based, or it was like super anecdotal. So like something would happen on one campus and people would go, oh, make these really huge claims about US society and culture and kids these days and all this stuff. And so as a sociologist, this is frustrating to me. I was like, well, if there has been some big cultural shift, we should be able to measure it. And so my colleagues and I set out to measure it. We analyzed like tens of millions of news articles and academic publications, and looked at changes in polling and surveys. We looked at changes in protest activity. We looked at changes in policies and entertainment outputs, and so on and so forth. And we saw a few things. The first thing we saw is that there was a there. The idea that there was something changed, something did change. The second thing we noticed is, though, that this change wasn't broad-based. It wasn't Americans as a whole that shifted. It was a pretty narrow subset of the American population and of American institutions. In particular, in terms of shifts in public opinion and shifts in political alignments and stuff, it was highly educated, relatively affluent, urban and suburban, especially white people that shifted, while the rest of America basically stayed on the same course. And in terms of the institutions and workplaces that were changing a lot, they were workplaces tied to symbolic industries, so like journalism, academia, consulting, finance. You didn't see huge changes in how janitors clean floors and how people who serve food. It was the knowledge economy industries that were undergoing these radical changes in their outputs and statements and policies and so on. And the nice thing about measuring, though, is that we could also see that this period of change that we saw after 2010 was actually a case of something. And there were previous periods using these same kind of empirical measures. We could see that there were previous periods of awakening like this. And we could compare and contrast them then and see, well, get leverage on questions like, well, why did these awakenings happen? Do they actually change anything? What do they change? Why don't they go on forever? Like, why do they end? On this question of why do they change anything? Yeah, one of the most disconcerting things that I discovered is that, yeah, when you look at periods of significant change in law or changes in allocations of resources and stuff, and you look at these periods of awakening, there's basically no correlation at all. Like, so for instance, if you look at the 1950s and 60s, almost all of the major achievements of the civil rights movement, both the Black civil rights movement and the Chicano civil rights movement, happened before the outbreak of major student protests and stuff like that after 1965. And similarly, a lot of things like Title IX, Civil Rights Act, so on. Title IX, affirmative action policies, policies against sexual harassment, and so on. None of these things seem to be, were policies of the awakenings. In fact, they happened before the awakenings or in between them. And you could see one of the reasons why a lot of these social movements during these periods of awakening didn't achieve much. There seemed to be a few factors at play. One of them was that the ways that a lot of us who work in the symbolic industries tend to engage in politics is often very alienating for a lot of other people. So I'll give an example of Occupy Wall Street. According to some narratives, Occupy Wall Street was this kind of broad class-based movement, and people often kind of distinguish Occupy from things like Black Lives Matter and so on. And you have people like Vivek Ramaswamy, who tells this kind of conspiratorial narrative that multinational corporations cooked up wokeness to distract people from Occupy and class-based. Okay, so the thing about Occupy, so social scientists have done studies of who took part in the Occupy Wall Street protests, and what we found is that overwhelmingly, actually, they were white-collar professionals. Of the people who were employed, overwhelmingly, they were employed in the symbolic industries. There were very few, like, blue-collar workers and so on. Almost overwhelmingly, the people who took part in Occupy had college degrees, often postgraduate degrees, and the ones who didn't have college degrees were typically currently enrolled in college at the time. There were very few people who didn't have ties to college who took part in Occupy. In terms of their class background, overwhelmingly, they were from families that earned more than the median income in the cities that they took part in. So this was a protest movement largely by relatively affluent professionals, white-collar, symbolic capitalists. And one of the things that's, and you could see this, actually, in some of the ways that they engaged in protest. So that, for instance, one of the things that defined Occupy was what they called the progressive stack. And this was a series of rules of, like, who could talk and in what order based on things like their race and ethnicity or their gender and so on. with the idea of kind of fronting forward people who are from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, this mode of politics, what you wouldn't see a movement of dock workers, like people coming down from the docks and they're like, you know what, we're gonna stand up to the man. And they're like, yeah. And they're like, all right, so what should we do? And the guy's like, okay, well, the first thing we've gotta do is set up arcane bureaucratic rules based on people's descriptive identity characteristics in order to talk. Like, that's not the way, like this kind of a thing is the way that we engage in politics, right? Like, we love rules and procedures and bureaucracy. We love to kind of front forward these kinds of things in a way that working class people do not. And even this narrative about we are the 99%, as Richard Reeves and others pointed out, this kind of narrative, it allowed people with healthy six-figure incomes and often and sometimes, you know, $1 million in assets and stuff like this, to be like, oh, yeah, it's 99%, yeah, I'm a little guy, I'm in the same boat as the guy who's flipping burgers at McDonald's. Him and I, we're in the same boat, we're just little guys against Jeff Bezos, right? And kind of, that's not really a class, that's not like a class-based movement in any like reasonable understanding of class. And so, yeah. And you could see, like one of the ways in which a lot of social movements have, if you look at the kind of movements that we tend to do versus the kind of movements that often do tend to change things, you can see a few things. So one of the ways in which a lot of more contemporary social movements have gone awry is that if you look at the civil rights movement, for instance, in the 50s, you had groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. They would sometimes meet on campus and organize, but they wouldn't organize on campus in order to carry out protests on campus. They would organize on campus, and then they would go out into the community alongside working class people, ordinary people, in part of a broad-based social movement in order to address tangible social problems, and with like a focus on, and this isn't the form that a lot of protests has today, for instance. If you take the example of a lot of the student protests on US campuses tied to the atrocities happening in Gaza right now. And this is something that I have a lot of skin in the game. I was mentioning, you know, my wife is from South Lebanon. Her family had to flee. They fled from South Lebanon to Beirut, and then Beirut was also getting bombed. We were very worried that her family was going to get killed. So it's not an issue that I take lightly. But if you look at the structure of that protest movement, how did it go? Well, it was a lot of the campus movements that you often saw. They were organizing on campus in order to carry out demonstrations on campus, with the major goal being like also tied to campus. So like, let's have the university president issue a statement, as if there's no scenario. The university president could read off the most radical statement that you could imagine with the purest fervor in her heart, and it wouldn't save one person's life. It wouldn't stop there's no scenario, there's no connection between the things they were asking to do and the things that they were trying to accomplish. None at all. And same thing, so having the university issue statements, trying to get new lines of study passed, looking at the university portfolio for investments, and like all of that stuff might be worth doing. Like some of that stuff might be worth doing in its own right, like independent of this, but what it's not gonna do is...
what Rosa Parks did.
Yeah, and so I think one of the problems with symbolic capitalists is in some ways we've kind of lost our confidence to engage with the public, to do what organizers in previous, so we're kind of really narcissistically focused on our own institutions, on our own communities. We don't really have a lot of, even movements like Occupy that were class-based, you saw the same kind of pattern where there's this kind of very, yeah.
Yeah. Emma, in a speech to a joint session of Congress in March, President Trump declared that, and I quote, "Our country will be woke no longer." He has since targeted diversity, equity and inclusion programs in the federal government, military and at universities. What is Trump trying to achieve, and can we see that being mirrored here?
I hope not. I certainly hope not. I mean, I think, you know, Trump is one of the ultimate culture warriors that Musa writes about. And I think we often are sucked into Trump's culture wars, I think, to see what he is doing to the military, for example, or to the US bureaucracy as part of an anti-woke agenda or a culture war. But it's much more sinister than that. You know, I think it's perhaps more useful to see Trump not so much as a culture warrior, but as a segregationist. Because that's what he is doing and what his administration is doing in those institutions, including in the military. You know, I think if we go back to, was it the day of or the days after Trump was inaugurated, there was that helicopter crash in Washington. And there were all kinds of accusations being flown around about the pilots and you know, whether they were black or whether the white pilots had been in close proximity to people who were there because of affirmative action, you know, who were black or women. And what this argument turned into was the idea that white men can't do their job if they're even in the presence of people who don't look like them. And so in clearing out the military of leadership that is not white men, you know, that is black or women or gay or trans, what the Trump administration is doing is implementing a segregationist agenda and hiding, I think, behind culture wars in order to do that. And the consequences of that for American democracy are potentially, I think, catastrophic. Whether it's imported into Australia or not, I think is quite a different question. You know, I think there were clear attempts during the election campaign by Peter Dutton to do that, to do a kind of Trump-light campaigning, particularly in the noise that he and the party were making about welcome to country ceremonies and how much they cost. You know, that's a Trumpian line. If
just punch down on blackfellas once again after The Voice.
Absolutely. And we saw the direct consequences of that and the immediate enabling of awful elements in our politics, you know, in people heckling at Remembrance Day ceremonies, at Anzac Day ceremonies. But what we saw in Australia, I think, at least in part in the election result, was a rejection of that kind of politics, was a rejection of culture war politics and a demonstration that there just isn't a big or influential constituency for Trumpist culture wars and Trumpist segregationist politics here in Australia, and that's for a number of reasons. You know, partly that sometimes we forget we're a different country with different political institutions, but that doesn't mean that you know, their bad faith actors won't attempt to import that kind of stuff into Australia, and we've seen that in little ways. You know, I hesitate to bring up the submarines, but in the scrambling around the submarines and this insistence on the part of a lot of Australian media and the right in Australian politics that we have to do everything we can to make sure Trump likes us and Trump lets us have those submarines and Trump continues to provide that security umbrella that we've always relied on. You know, we have to give him whatever he wants. Should we just give him all of our critical minerals? Should we just give him our pharmaceutical benefit scheme? You know, this is the extent of some of the commentary, which is quite extraordinary. But in that, there have been calls by some other members of the commentariat that Australia's woke military policies will turn Trump off and be a reason for him to not give us those submarines. So there are still elements of our politics that I think we have to guard against that really seek to import those kinds of culture wars.
Well, we can resolve this actually, because after we get Canada, we'll just import y'all as the 52nd state. So one of the things I stress in the book is that these periods of awakening are usually followed by backlash. Now the way that people often describe the backlash is that it's backlash against gains made by by minorities and women and so on, that there's a backlash against that. But as I show in the book, in these periods of awakening, there actually aren't typically much gain. So in the US, for instance, if you look at like what substantively changed for the better for a lot of, for historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups beyond the symbolic realm of representation here, representation there in terms of like tangible benefits for the genuinely marginalized and disadvantaged in society, very little. So the backlash isn't against that. Part of what drives the backlash is that even under ordinary times, I show in the book, the ways that symbolic capitalists tend to talk and think about politics is unusual compared to the rest of America. We kind of think about it, and this isn't just unique to the left. Even right-aligned symbolic capitalists, as I show, like anti-woke, kind of right-leaning people, they don't engage in politics any different than the people they're criticizing. Actually, I can circle back to that point in the Q&A if people want. But so we think about politics in unusual ways. And so even under ordinary times, there's this kind of gap. During these periods of awakening, that gap grows bigger because people like us tend to shift a lot. Most of the rest of America stays on the same path that they were on. We notice the gap between us and everyone else growing bigger. We tend to assume that the reason it's going bigger is because those people are getting more racist and sexist and so on. Even though when you look at the data, when you actually look at the trend lines, you just see consistency. You don't see that. If anything, they're continuing to grow marginally more progressive along race, gender, sexuality. A lot of these cultural issues, the American public has just been on a kind of gradually more kind of progressive slope for a long time. So we change, and people not only notice that the gap is growing bigger, but they care about the gap more, largely because of how we conduct ourselves. So during these periods of awakening, we become a lot more confrontational. We become a lot more intolerant. So we mock, harass, we try to censor and demean people who don't agree with us, even for policy positions that we adopted 10 minutes ago. So like 10 minutes ago, a lot of symbolic capitalists will have decided that we need to completely abolish the police stations, abolish the police instead of kind of more marginal reforms. And these people who just adopted this position 10 minutes ago, if you challenge them on it, they'll call you a racist for disagreeing with them about a position that they adopted 10 minutes ago. This kind of approach causes people to notice the gap between us and them and to care about it more. And this creates an opportunity for political entrepreneurs, usually associated with the right, to basically campaign on bringing people like us under control. So narratives like the media has become a propaganda machine for the Democratic Party, or universities, they're not teaching your kids useful knowledge and skills, they're just indoctrinating the youth. These kinds of narratives become more popular in the aftermath of the awakenings, and you usually see a few things. You see the creation of alternative knowledge economy infrastructures like Fox News or Elon Musk's anti-woke takeover of Twitter. You see
and there's a real formula there, isn't there, of getting people to anger very quickly.
Yeah.
And yeah, it groups people quite quickly into an angry sort of outpouring.
Well, there's kind of two things happening that are kind of both important to note. Is there is this kind of campaign to generate outrage and so on, and there's also though there are senses in which, again, we are during these periods becoming less representative of the public as a whole in terms of our views, and we're often conducting ourselves in ways that seem unusual and untrustworthy, and so you usually see gains by the political right in the short to medium term. But the reason the gains don't go on forever, though, is because the right-leaning parties often take the wrong message from any political gains they get. So oftentimes, people who are frustrated with the left vote for right-leaning parties because they don't want culture wars. They're done with culture wars. And what a lot of right-leaning people take from their victory is, they voted out the left, so they must really want right-wing culture wars. They must really like right-wing kind of and so they try to give them what they think the people want, and they alienate and so you end up seeing a kind of waffling. So the right usually doesn't.
There's been some analysis here that Peter Dutton took his win on The Voice as an indication that, fight more culture wars, but that was rejected. And in fact, he lost his seat in the election.
Most voters, to the extent that they, one of the things that makes us unusual is that we're especially likely to be motivated to vote based on symbolic issues. We vote more consistently, we vote even if we don't like the candidates, and so on. A lot of other voters, most voters, they vote mostly in the service of kind of concrete goals. They're concerned mostly about bread and butter, practical kind of issues, and oftentimes, if they don't like either of the candidates, they'll just sit the race out. They can find better things to do on a Tuesday, right? And so,
do you wish you had compulsory voting like us?
Compulsory voting would be useful in some senses. I think that the outcomes of that, in terms of the Democrat-Republican race, would be unpredictable, in part because one of the things you can see in this 2024 race, after the election, I wrote this kind of piece that went viral called A Graveyard of Bad Election Narratives. And one of the narratives that immediately happened after the election is that the reason Kamala lost is because there wasn't a lot of turnout. Like if turnout was higher, then Kamala would have won. Like there's this assumption that a lot of progressives have, that there's this kind of just huge base of support for a lot of their kind of culturally left policies out there, and they just have to mobilize the voters. But what I show in the thing is that actually, for one, in the swing states, turnout was not down. Turnout was only down in the decisively red and blue states where the outcome of that particular state was taken for granted. In the swing states, turnout was actually up. And you could see that actually among kind of non-traditional, among voters who don't vote consistently, who don't vote every single election, they actually shifted the most towards the Republican Party. And so if more of those people went to the polls, the loss would have probably been bigger, not smaller, bigger. I like the idea of compulsory voting in a sense, in the sense that it would be good to hear more from these kind of underrepresented Americans. It would be good for politicians to try harder to win all of those votes instead of taking for granted that, focusing on the constituencies that are most likely to vote and writing off others. But what I would just urge people to be aware of in the US especially is that while that's a good policy, and in fact, this is actually good that the outcome of it politically is unpredictable. That's good. That means that both parties, in principle, could embrace it. It's not a thing that would necessarily benefit one party or the other off the armchair, so they don't. But yeah, who knows how that would turn out? I'll say this.
Emma, Zoran Mamdani, is that how I say it? A self-proclaimed democratic socialist, recently defied the polls to win the Democratic primary in New York City. His campaign attempted to focus almost exclusively on material conditions for working people. Do you have any reflections on his campaign and what it means for America?
I do. I do. Yeah, look, I think this is one of the examples of exactly what Musa writes about. This is a campaign by a Democrat that is focusing on the issues that genuinely affect people's lives. His campaign was razor sharp in its focus on the cost of living in particular, which is an enormous problem in New York City. And he did the work. Musa and I were talking about this earlier today. He did the work of walking across New York and talking to people, engaging with voters in mobilising a grassroots base of support against a concerted effort to drag him into culture war politics, particularly about things he had said when he was younger, things that he has said in support of Palestinians. And that happened not just from the right, not just from the usual candidates, including the President of the United States, that has threatened to denaturalise and then deport him because of what he has said, but on the part of Democrats as well, senior establishment Democrats like Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, who said some appalling things about this candidate drawn straight out of the anti-Muslim rhetoric of the war on terror, to the point where she had to apologise to him because they were so bad. But he has resisted so far, successfully resisted being dragged into these exact culture wars, and has had success so far because of that. And I think we can see the kinds of political success that there is potential for with the Democrats when they do that kind of engagement with the base. You can see that in support for Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and their tour and their engagement. So there are signs there, I think, of engagement with the base, but also of the huge disconnect between that base and the senior leadership of the Democratic Party that is still refusing to learn the lessons of exactly what Musa is talking about in terms of the way that campaign just refused to acknowledge the problems that people were facing.
I'll add real quick on the Democratic Party. One of the things that, one of the kind of disturbing realizations that also helped spur the book is before, when I started this project, and when I started this journey more broadly, if you had asked me who was responsible for name the problem, whatever the problem was, poverty, racial inequality, whatever, pollution. I would have said, my answer would have been simple. I would have said the millionaires and the billionaires and those damn Republicans. And I would have understood those groups to be largely coextensive, that the Republican Party is the party of the millionaires and the billionaires and so on. But one of the problems that I had when I was living in, as I started living in Manhattan and paying attention more, is that, so when I first moved to Manhattan, one of the things that struck me immediately was that there's this kind of racialized caste system there where people of certain racial and ethnic groups were producing all these services that knowledge economy professionals rely on to live these really idiosyncratic lifestyles that we live in these major cities, while people of other racial and ethnic groups were consuming those services. You saw human suffering on a scale that I had never witnessed before, just immense amounts of human suffering. People on the streets, homeless, mentally ill people, and so on and so forth, just suffering, miserable. In a way that you almost grow numb to a little bit, that you have to almost grow numb to in order to kind of go about your business. And then when you realize that this human suffering doesn't affect you the way it used to, that's also pretty terrible. And then when you zoom out and you look at the macro level, like New York City has immense concentrations of wealth. It has the largest concentration of millionaires and billionaires in the world. 1 out of every 13 people in New York is a millionaire or a billionaire. It also has huge amounts of poverty. 20% of the population is poor, despite all that wealth. It's one of the ranks really low in the nation for social mobility, 44 out of 50. The rich stay rich, the poor stay poor. It has the most racially segregated school system in the country. And when I was trying to think about, why is New York like this? Who's to blame for this state of affairs? I realized pretty quickly that there was one group that I couldn't blame, and that's those damn Republicans. If you look at New York City Council, Democrats outnumber Republicans 10-1. The mayor of New York City is a Democrat. The governor of New York State is a Democrat. Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1 in the New York State legislature. If you look at our federal representatives, both of our senators are Democrats. Our congressional delegation is overwhelmingly Democrats. And so there wasn't a way that I could tell myself, well, oh yeah, if only we flip the two red seats on the New York City Council, if only we get rid of those 2 Republicans, then it'll turn from this kind of highly unequal thing into a socialist utopia. The real problem is these 2 Republicans. No, the problem in many cases is elements of the Democratic Party. Gillibrand is a perfect example. New York senator, right? She's exactly one of these 2 people I was talking about. Out there doing her thing to try to sandbag, in this case, even someone from her own party, and so yeah, one of the things that I realized, and this isn't just unique to New York, like when I go to Los Angeles, when I go to Boston, when I go to any of these other cities, I usually pull up the data for those cities, and you see the same kinds of trends. Immense amounts of human suffering alongside immense amounts of wealth in areas that Democrats control with basically one-party rule. And so I realized that, while it's definitely important and necessary to push back against a lot of the Republican Party's illiberal efforts and efforts to dismantle a lot of institutions and so on and so forth, it is important to temper our expectation about what voting blue, no matter who, can actually accomplish unless and until there's kind of the Democratic Party itself evolves.
Now, let me just say, if you'd like to ask a question, we've got 2 microphones. We need to have you on the microphones just for the recording, and I'd love you to line up and come and ask a question. I suppose I'll just come to the sort of, if there's a lot of symbolic capitalists sitting in this room, we're trying to do the right thing. We want to live a good life. We want to share. How do we do it, Musa? What is the way? And I mean, our tax system is different. We do have a healthcare system. We do have a safety net. It's not perfect. The Australia Institute is doing its damnness. We managed to do a lot of work on the Stage 3 tax cuts and point out that it was the poor that were going to be paying more tax than proportionally, and the company tax. So, we do have think tanks and research institutes like the Australia Institute doing that sort of work. But how do we live a good life?
So I guess... It occurs to me that I think we've used the term symbolic capitalist, but I've never really defined it. So let me just take 1 second to do that. So the we and we have never been woke is this group of, this elite constellation I call symbolic capitalists. So symbolic capitalists are people who make a living based on what they know, who they know, and how they're known. So by cultivating and leveraging what sociologists call symbolic capital. Okay, less nerdy way of saying this. Symbolic capitalists are people who manipulate symbols and data and ideas and stuff like this instead of providing physical goods and services to people. So if you work in fields like consulting, finance, media, education, law, so on and so forth, you're a symbolic capitalist. Education, I'm a symbolic capitalist. There's a bunch of things that are interesting about symbolic capitalists. One that I'll just really quickly note is that symbolic capitalists, a lot of our professions are explicitly defined in terms of altruism and the common good. So if you look at us as a group, we get much more pay than most other workers, a lot more autonomy, a lot more prestige. And we've said from the beginning of our professions in their modern form that the reason you should give us this pay and autonomy and stuff is not for our own sake, but better, if you give us these things, it will empower us to help everyone in society, including and especially the least among us, the marginalized and the disadvantaged. So, and a lot of our fields are formally defined in terms of altruism. So my own fields, journalists, we're supposed to speak truth to power. We're supposed to be a voice for the voiceless, you know? Academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to speak the truth, regardless of anyone else's political interests, moral, economic interests, and so on. If you look at who in America is most likely to self-identify as anti-racist, as feminist, as environmentalists, as allies to LGBTQ people, it's us. We're overwhelmingly aligned with the Democratic Party. We overwhelmingly align as liberal or left or progressive, or something that indicates not right-wing. And so given how we like to understand ourselves, how we define our professions and so on, the puzzle the book wants to, the main puzzle in a way that the book is trying to investigate is this, is that over the last 50 years especially, there were these big changes to the global order that gave symbolic capitalists a lot more power and influence over society. We have a lot more wealth in our control than ever. We have a lot more influence over policymaking than ever, and so on and so forth. And so given how we understand ourselves and describe ourselves, what you might expect is that as people like us have more affluence and influence, you'd expect to see inequality shrinking. You'd expect to see long-standing social problems getting fixed. You'd expect to see growing trust in institutions because of all the good work that we're doing, you know? Instead, over the last 50 years, we've seen the opposite. We've seen growing inequalities, growing institutional dysfunction and mistrust, growing affective polarization. A lot of long-standing social problems have festered and grown worse. And so the core puzzle, the core thing the book is trying to wrestle with basically is like, why is that? Why do we see the world we see instead of the world that we might have hoped or expected or promised? And as I said—
Because we're greedy, selfish bastards?
Well, and so the story I tell in the book is that the core tension that's really defined symbolic capitalists from the beginning of our professions is that on the one hand, we are sincerely committed to these social justice values. So when we say things like we want poor people to live better lives and we want the people at the margins to live lives of dignity, like we're not lying. When people were crying after George Floyd was killed, you know, it was a performance, but it wasn't just a performance. People were sad, you know. The problem is, this set of commitments, while sincere, genuinely sincere, it's not our only set of commitments, though. Most of us are also sincerely committed to being elites, which is to say, we think that our perspectives should carry more weight than the people checking us out at the grocery store. That our preferences should matter more to stakeholders. We think we should have a significantly higher standard of living than the people who deliver our packages. And we want our children to reproduce our own social position or to do even better than us. And we work really aggressively for that. And so in this set of commitments, the commitment to being an elite is also very sincere. And these two sets of sincere commitments are in fundamental tension, right? We have You can't actually be an egalitarian social climber. It's a contradiction in terms. And so what I argue in the book is that when these two sets of sincere commitments come into conflict, as they often do, it's our commitment to be an elite that often ends up kind of winning out in a sense and kind of transforming how we pursue these social justice goals. So we end up pursuing them mostly in ways that don't cost anything for us, risk anything for us, require us to change anything about our own aspirations, our aspirations for our children. Mostly we try to solve these things by extracting things from others, blaming other people, and so on. But one of the things I stress in the book, and I can elaborate this in the Q&A, I'll stop talking now because I want to have time for questions, is that it's actually tough for us to actually solve a lot of these problems we're concerned about if we're only focused on the top 1% and the millionaires and the billionaires and so on. Our fantasy has always been that if we just tax Elon Musk hard enough, we can solve these problems. But it's actually a lot more complicated for that, for reasons I'd be happy to discuss.
We have got a question here.
G'day, thank you. So I'm still struggling with this idea, so this might be a bit incoherent. So while my unconscious is formulating a question, thank you for the Australia Institute for putting this in and for Musa for coming over. And maybe Musa and Emma, you could both think about this, but if it's not the Democrats or the Republicans, what is it and who is it? And to come to your last point, if we want to change it, you know, like we the elite have been losing. I mean, one of Richard Dennis's things is we are losing, we got to do something different. What is it different that we as the elite have to do, and how can we do it, and how would that apply to Australia as much as to the United States, which we can see falling apart around itself? I'll leave it at that.
So in terms of one of the things that we were discussing earlier today is that a lot of our institutions right now, we face two problems. One challenge that we have to do is we have to be able to affirm the value of a lot of our institutions, affirm the value of things like why is it that we have academic freedom and so on. We have to defend these things and explain our value. On the other hand, there are legitimate problems with a lot of our institutions that are driving some of the unrest. So for instance, when people perceive that the media doesn't represent them, this isn't like Fox News misinformation. Great, Murdoch is here, so like he's not here, but he's here in Australia. Like he's Australian, so
No,
so
he's American.
Oh, he is?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought he was.
We actually had a prime minister bring in a rule so that he could apply for his Australian citizenship again, and he never took it up. He's American. He's yours. I'm very firm on that one.
Okay, so Murdoch aside, so when people feel like journalism, that journalists and journalistic outlets don't represent them, like this isn't misinformation. In fact, if you look at the composition of journalists, for instance, in the 1970s in the United States, journalists, about half of them had bachelor's degrees, but just about half. And they had, the ones that had degrees in a wide variety of stuff. Today, 95% of journalists have the college degrees, almost exclusively in journalism and communication. As more and more people have degrees, they focus more on Ivy schools. So journalists today, like outlets like the New York Times, have higher concentrations of Ivy League graduates than the US Senate. Media organizations are increasingly consolidated in a smaller and smaller number of cities. We focus mostly on elite problems, in part because when you look at the composition of who is journalists, who we are, we're increasingly, again, elite ourselves. And so when we're trying to hold the elites to account, the elites we're supposed to be holding to account are our college buddies, they're our lovers, they're our neighbors, they're our family members. And so this kind of complicates the, and so when people sense that journalistic outlets don't reflect people like them and their concerns and their communities, this isn't misinformation. It's actually a brute reality of the structure and operation of contemporary journalism. And it's important to be able to kind of recognize and acknowledge and try to deal with some of these problems. The temptation we often have is that when we see our institutions under attack, we often feel this impulse to kind of reactively defend them and say, nothing to see here, these institutions are great actually, and the only reason you think they weren't great is if you're racist or stupid or misinformed. And this is a mistake. It's a strategic mistake. Because if a lot of people have concerns about our institutions, and they get two narratives from people, one of them is that there's nothing to see here, and the other one is, you know what? These institutions do have problems, and they'll never fix themselves. You can't trust them to fix themselves. You need to empower someone like me to come in there and straighten them out. If those are the two narratives they get, that second one will win every day, because the first narrative, nothing to see here, enforces the second narrative that we'll never fix ourselves. So we need to, on the one hand, acknowledge and try to address some of these problems within our institutions in the ways they aren't serving a lot of the public. And on the same time, we need to defend the value of these institutions. So they have problems, but don't burn them to the ground. And we need to demonstrate a commitment to try to address some of these problems ourselves if we don't want some kind of heavy-handed outside thing. To the extent that we don't do that, we're actually empowering, we're giving more ammunition to people like Trump and DeSantis and analogous parties in other countries.
Now, I'm conscious it's 7 o'clock, so I might, is everyone okay if we go over? Is that okay with the Australia Institute? Hannah's giving me the thumbs up there. We'll just go to another question.
Okay, thanks. I've actually got several questions, but I'll just go with one at the moment.
Just go with one, I think.
Yeah. Musa, the term woke, and I'm wondering what you think about the way Martin Luther King Jr. used his term, and as I understand it was more in terms of awareness and conscientisation. I'm glad I can pronounce that word. Was he talking about a different we, or how do you think about the way he used the concept?
Yeah. So one of the things that I do in the book is I do this is I walk people through the history of the term woke and the way it's been used by different stakeholders over time. And so I go through the whole history of the term. One of the things I stress in the book is that woke is a much contested term. There are other terms that have served a similar function in the past, actually. So during the last awakening, the big term that everyone used, instead of talking about woke and wokeness, they used the word politically correct. And we can use, if you look at political correctness and its trajectory, you can gain a lot of insight on the current contestation around woke. So, real quick. Political correctness is also a term with a long history. It goes back to communist organizing, like decades, right? When people used politically correct, originally, they used it on the left to mean my moral and political views are correct. I'm politically correct. They meant it literally, right? And people would use politically incorrect in the way that we use problematic now. So they'd be like, hey, bro, that's politically incorrect. Okay. Gradually, there came to be this dispute within the left about political correctness, where one faction of the left continued to use politically correct to mean my moral and political views are correct. Other people on the left started associating political correctness with this sanctimonious, purely symbolic form of politics. And then gradually, people on the right seized on this dispute within the left and started using political correctness, that label, as a cudgel to attack anything they didn't like. And eventually, it became hard for anyone to identify as politically correct unironically, and even identifying as politically incorrect took on a positive valence. Like Bill Maher had this show called Politically Incorrect, right? And you can see a similar trend happening now with woke. So it had a certain kind of meaning within one group of the left. There came to be this dispute within the left about wokeness and whether or not it was effective. Right-leaning outlets started, right-leaning political figures and outlets seized on this dispute and started attacking everything they don't like as woke. Now, a lot of people don't self-identify as woke. It's like very few people do. There's this great poll that I show in the book where they asked Americans, what do you think of the term woke? And most Americans actually had a positive, at that time, it was in 2021, but had a positive view of the word. They had positive associations with it. And then they asked, okay, if someone called you woke, would you understand that to be an insult or a compliment? And despite the fact that most Americans had a positive association with the word woke, they understood that in the current milieu, if someone calls you that, they're not paying you a compliment. So we can see the similar kind of trajectory that we saw for political correctness happening now with the term wokeness. And so likely in the future, if there's another kind of period of social justice, of rapid change in how people talk and think about social justice, another great awakening, probably the word woke won't be essential to it any more than political correctness was today. There will probably be some other way in which people try to understand and describe kind of what their moral and political convictions are and things like that.
I think the place you hear it most now is Sky News, which is our version of Fox. It's like, I think they've probably got a show called Woke, Anti-Woke, or it's the place you hear it. Are there any other questions? Emma, did you want to just come in with to sort of wrap about how you feel about this book, what we can take from this, how it applies to Australia?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we have a very different political culture, and so I think we have to be careful about assuming that, you know, we can directly apply American politics to Australian politics. But I mean, maybe if I take the first question around, you know, where does, if not the Democrats, then who? Because I think there's some lessons for that in Australia as well. Because there's, I think, a particularly American inclination to look for a superhero, to look for a charismatic leader who's going to come in and be able to take it to Trump and to bring people along with them, almost inevitably him. You know, if you follow American news as closely as I do, you'll see there was a moment just a couple of weeks ago where people were asking, where's Obama? Where's Obama? Why isn't he doing more to save us? Why isn't he explaining this to us and telling us how to oppose Trump, right? Obama's not coming. Nobody's coming, you know, and I don't think looking to the Democrats in particular for that kind of charismatic leadership is where you find concerted opposition to Trump. I think if you look at American history and also Australian history, you know, the biggest progressive changes have come from the building of a grassroots coalition of people. You know, we've talked a little bit about the civil rights movement, for example, you know, that wasn't something, the Civil Rights Act wasn't something that LBJ thought was a good idea. That was something he was forced into by a concerted, diverse coalition of the Democratic base. And we see that repeated, I think, throughout American history in the anti-slavery movement, for example. And the United States is extraordinarily good at reinventing and revitalising itself. And I think, at the risk of being too positive, I think we can see the seeds of that happening again in the United States, in Los Angeles, in New York, across the Midwest, where, you know, what Trump is doing is so appalling, it's so deeply offensive to the security of Americans, that the seeds of that kind of coalition, the kind of coalition that Bobby Kennedy, the good Bobby Kennedy, was building in 1968, it may reappear in a different form. But I think that's where it comes from, and that lesson is true for Australia as well.
The last couple of lines in your book, and you quote political theorist Teresa Bejan. At bottom, equality is not something to be believed in, but rather something to be enacted. It's not a cause to be supported in the abstract. It's something we do. So that's kind of your whole about why you decided to write this book. And by the way, there's 100 pages of references and sources at the back of this book. This has been an enormous amount of work. This is an amazing discussion, and that's, where do you want to leave us? What do you want us thinking about here in Australia?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a good note to end on. I think the fundamental problem that we face, that symbolic capitalists have faced from the outset, is the problem again isn't that we don't have that we don't believe hard enough, or that we don't have enough people who believe. Like a lot of these institutions and communities are the places where people believe in the largest numbers. And a lot of these, the problem is that beliefs don't necessarily translate into actions. There's not this kind of automatic, and in fact, in a way, this is one way in which activism often goes awry, to the extent that we focus really hard on changing people's hearts and minds and suppressing people who don't think and feel and say the right things about these social issues. That doesn't necessarily do much to actually solve a lot of the problems. If we should be focusing more on reallocating resources and opportunities, on thinking about how institutions are structured, how they function, and this is going to be generally more helpful for addressing a lot of these problems and trying to micromanage our own and other people's thoughts and feelings and speech acts and stuff like that.
Look, it's an amazing book. This has been a great discussion. Thanks so much. I just want to say that Musa will be signing books, and if you ever come to any conversations that I'm in, you know that I'm a non-drinker, so I never take alcohol to people's houses, I take books. So look, stock up on some books. This one will start many, many conversations, and they go in quite ferocious ways. At lunch this week, I had people just completely challenge me about I was talking to you, and that's a good thing. So I really want to thank Dr Emma Shortis and Dr Musa al-Gharbi for their amazing conversation, and thank you for coming tonight and for your support of the Australia Institute. Thanks so much.
Thanks for watching. We love that we can make these videos free to watch, but they're not free to make. It's thanks to our generous supporters that we can keep making research and content that changes minds. So, if you like what we do, please consider giving to the Australia Institute so we can keep doing it. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au and click the donate button to see how your support can help fund high quality research that matters.